Before I share this chapter of my life with you, a chapter one still find myself replaying in the quiet hours of the night. I want you to know that I never sought to inflict pain, only to reclaim what was mine, my work, my dignity, and a piece of my heart that had been carelessly discarded. My son, Mark, the boy I'd rocked to sleep with flour on my hands, the young man whose college tuition was paid for with the sweet scent of rising dough and honest toil, told me I was too slow, too old-fashioned for the business I'd poured my soul into. He said my ways were archaic, that I was a relic in his grand, modern vision. He didn't just nudge me aside, he tried to erase me. But, as you'll soon hear, this old clock wasn't done chiming. This is the story of how Eleanor Ainsworth, the woman deemed too slow, not only found my footing but ended up showing my ambitious son what true, lasting success really looks like, right in the heart of the business he thought he'd so cleverly reinvented. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt underestimated, because I truly believe there's a strength in us that only reveals itself when we're pushed to our limits. It all began, or perhaps I should say, it all began to unravel on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always delivery days for the specialty flowers, the Belgian chocolate, the vanilla beans I insisted came all the way from Madagascar. For 35 years, since my beloved Arthur and I first hung the shingle for the sweet spot, Tuesdays had a rhythm, a comforting predictability. But this Tuesday, the air in the back office, which still smelled faintly of yeast and old ledgers despite Mark's chrome and glass renovations, was tight with a tension I hadn't anticipated. Mark stood by the window, not looking at the delivery truck, but at some distant point only he could see, a point that I sensed was far removed from the gentle, fragrant world of our bakery. He was tapping his expensive pen against a sheaf of papers, the logo of some consulting firm I didn't recognize emblazoned at the top. "Mom," he began, his voice lacking its usual warmth, "we need to talk about the future. I'd always thought the future of the Sweet Spot was an extension of its past, quality, community, the taste of home." I'd helped him take over the daily operations after Arthur passed, thinking he shared that vision. He'd been eager, full of ideas, and I, perhaps naively, had trusted his youthful energy, assuming it was anchored by the same foundational respect for our craft. I soon learned that his energy was more like a runaway train, and I was just an obstacle on the tracks. He spoke of streamlining, of optimizing, of capturing new demographics. Words that sounded efficient but felt cold, alien to the soul of our little bakery. "The margins are too tight with these artisanal suppliers, Mom," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the invoices I still meticulously checked. "And the time it takes for your traditional methods, frankly, it's not scalable." I remember feeling a chill despite the warm ovens in the next room. "Scalable," I echoed. "Mark, we're a neighborhood bakery, not a factory. People come here because they know everything is made with care, with the best ingredients," he sighed, a sound of profound impatience that pricked at my heart more than any angry word could have. "That's exactly the problem," he said, finally turning to look at me, his eyes holding a mixture of pity and resolve that made me feel ancient. "Your methods, your pace. Mom, you're too slow. The market is changing. We need to be agile, responsive, too slow." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Too slow for what? For churning out soulless pastries? For forgetting the names of customers who'd been coming since they were children? For taking the time to let dough rise properly, to hand-decorate a birthday cake with the birthday girl's favorite flowers meticulously piped in buttercream? He went on to explain his plan, a new, catchy name he was testing. Quick Bite Delights was one horror I recall, a centralized kitchen for some items, pre-made mixes for others, a focus on volume and online orders with aggressive marketing. My role, he suggested delicately, could be more advisory. Perhaps a few hours a week, if I liked, for old time's sake. He didn't say it, but the implication was clear. I was being pensioned off, put out to pasture from the place Arthur and I had built from nothing, from dreams and a shared passion. Susan, his wife, who had always treated the Sweet Spot as a quaint little hobby that kept her mother-in-law occupied, chimed in later that week with a bright, false smile. "Oh, Eleanor, it'll be so much less stress for you. Mark is so clever with these modern business things. You can finally relax, take up a hobby. A hobby. As if 35 years of 7-day weeks, of early mornings and late nights, of kneading dough until my shoulders ached and balancing books until my eyes burned, was just something to fill the time. I remembered bringing a baby Mark into the bakery, setting up his playpen in a corner of the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and sugar his first lullaby. I remembered him, as a teenager, reluctantly helping out on Saturdays, always more interested in the cash register than the craft, but I'd hoped the essence of it, the integrity, had seeped in.
Clearly it hadn't.
That day, I walked out of the office, the ghost of Arthur's encouraging smile flickering in my mind, and felt a profound sense of displacement. I was no longer Eleanor Ainsworth, baker and co-founder of the Sweet Spot. I was just
Mom.
And I was too slow. The weight of those words, the casual cruelty of them, settled deep in my bones, colder than any winter morning. The weeks that followed were a blur of bewildered pain and a creeping sense of erasure. I tried initially to engage with Mark, to offer my perspective, born from decades of experience. Mark, dear, I'd say gently, Mrs. Peterson has been buying our 7-grain bread for 20 years. She won't take kindly to a recipe change just to save a few pennies on seeds. He'd pat my hand, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt utterly patronizing. Mom, we're looking at the bigger picture. We can't cater to every individual whim if we want to grow. His bigger picture seemed to involve alienating every loyal customer we had. I'd visit the bakery. I couldn't quite bring myself to call it Quick Bite Delights, or whatever new iteration it was undergoing in his mind, and my heart would ache. The aroma was different, flatter, tinged with something artificial. The pastries in the display case looked uniform, too perfect, lacking the subtle imperfections that spoke of a human hand. The young staff, hired for their speed rather than their warmth, barely made eye contact. They didn't know the regulars, didn't ask about their families, didn't offer a child a tiny piece of broken cookie with a conspiratorial wink, as I always had. The soul of the Sweet Spot was being systematically hollowed out, replaced by a cold, corporate efficiency. I saw familiar faces, old customers, peering through the window with hesitant expressions, some venturing in, only to leave looking disappointed. A few sought me out, finding me in my garden or at the local library. Eleanor, Mrs. Henderson, a customer since our opening week, confided, her voice trembling slightly, "It's just not the same.
The scones are dry."
And that young man at the counter, he hardly looked up from his phone. Each comment was a fresh stab, a confirmation of my deepest fears. Mark, in his quest for speed and profit, was dismantling not just a business, but a community cornerstone. He was so focused on attracting a new, fleeting clientele that he failed to see the value in the steadfast loyalty he was carelessly discarding. I felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the bakery but for the son I thought I knew. How could he be so blind, so dismissive of the very essence of what had made us successful? My attempts to offer advice were met with increasing impatience. "Mom, with all due respect, you're thinking small," he'd say, that with all due respect, a flimsy veil for his irritation. This is the 21st century. People want fast, they want cheap, they want Instagrammable. They don't care if the vanilla is from Madagascar or if the dough had a 3-hour rise. The casual disdain in his voice for the craft I cherished, the craft that had fed him, clothed him, educated him, was a bitter pill to swallow. Susan was no better. She'd make comments about how liberated I must feel, free from the drudgery of the bakery. "Now you can finally go on that cruise you always talked about, Eleanor," she'd chirp, oblivious to the fact that my dream cruise was always a distant fantasy, secondary to the reality of running a demanding small business, a reality I had embraced, not endured. There were days I'd just sit in my armchair, Arthur's old reading glasses in my hand, and let the grief wash over me. It felt as though a part of me had died. The bakery wasn't just a building or a business. It was an extension of my marriage, a repository of memories, a testament to a life lived with purpose. And Mark was treating it like an old house to be gutted and flipped. The insult of "too slow" echoed constantly. Was it slowness to insist on quality? Was it slowness to build relationships? Was it slowness to honor a legacy? Or was it simply that I, in my 60s, was an inconvenient reminder of a past he was eager to shed, an anchor to values he no longer possessed? The hope that he would see reason, that he would realize his folly before it was too late, began to dwindle, replaced by a quiet ache of resignation. I was grieving, not just for the sweet spot, but for the shared dream that now lay in ruins. The slow burn of sorrow and helplessness might have consumed me entirely if not for an incident that acted like a bellows on a dying ember. It was a Saturday morning, a time when the sweet spot used to be a hive of cheerful chaos, the air thick with the scent of coffee and warm pastries, families chattering, regulars catching up. I'd steeled myself to walk past, a habit I couldn't quite break, a painful pilgrimage to the site of my former life. The new, garish sign, Zoom Suites, made me wince. As I drew nearer, I saw Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 80s who had ordered a small, plain poppy seed cake from us every other Saturday for the past 15 years, a tradition she'd started with her late husband. She was standing at the counter, looking distressed, clutching her worn handbag. A young, gum-chewing employee was speaking to her with ill-concealed impatience. "Look, lady," the employee said, loud enough for me to hear from the doorway, "we don't do plain poppy seed anymore. It's not on the menu. You can have a blueberry blast muffin or a triple choc chip cookie. And we don't do tabs. Cash or card up front." Mrs. Gable looked utterly lost. "But Eleanor always," she knew. She stammered, her eyes welling up. My heart constricted. Before I could step in, Mark emerged from the back, drawn by the slightly raised voices. He saw Mrs. Gable, then saw me lingering at the entrance. A flash of annoyance crossed his face. "What's the problem here?" he asked, his tone clipped. The employee rolled her eyes. "She wants some weird old cake we don't make." Mark gave Mrs. Gable a cursory, dismissive glance. "Sorry, madam," he said, his voice devoid of any real empathy. "We've updated our offerings. We're all about fresh and fast now." Then, catching my eye again, he added, with a pointed look, "We can't get bogged down with 100 special requests. It's just not efficient." Mrs. Gable, tears now silently tracing paths down her wrinkled cheeks, turned and shuffled out, defeated. I watched her go, a wave of cold fury washing over me, so potent it almost made me tremble. Efficient. That was his god now. Efficiency that trampled on loyalty, on kindness, on simple human decency. Later that day, I was pruning roses in my garden, the thorns catching on my skin, mirroring the barbs in my heart, when Susan drove up. She got out of her expensive SUV, looking flustered. "Eleanor," she said, without preamble, "Mark is having a tough time with the transition. Some of the old suppliers are being difficult, and frankly, some of the older customers are just resistant to change. He was wondering, those old recipe books of yours, the handwritten ones? He thinks there might be a couple of things in there he could, adapt. For a throwback special or something. Just to appease the dinosaurs. That's what we were to them. The loyal customers and me. And he wanted my recipes. The ones Arthur and I had perfected over years. The ones filled with my annotations, with Arthur's little jokes in the margins, the very soul of the sweet spot. He wanted to adapt them. For a gimmick. That was the last straw. The pain, the sadness, the bewilderment. They didn't vanish, but they were suddenly overshadowed by a steely resolve. He thought I was slow. He thought I was a relic, a dinosaur, easily dismissed and plundered for parts. A quiet voice, a voice that sounded remarkably like my own but firmer, more resolute than I'd felt in months, spoke in my mind.
"No."
Not anymore. That evening, instead of rereading an old novel, I pulled out my largest mixing bowl. I found my well-worn apron, the one stained with decades of fruit juice and chocolate. I went to my pantry, where I still kept a small stash of the good flour, the real butter, the vanilla from Madagascar. And I began to bake. I made Mrs. Gable's plain poppy seed cake. Not a fancy, Instagrammable confection, but a simple, honest cake, made with care and the best ingredients. The familiar rhythm of measuring, mixing, the scent filling my small kitchen. It was like coming home. The anger didn't dissipate, but it transformed, channeled into the precise movements, into the creation of something good, something real. He thought I was finished? I was just getting started. I would show him what slow and steady, infused with passion and integrity, could truly achieve. Not for revenge, not entirely, but to prove that true value isn't measured in speed or profit margins alone, but in heart, in quality, in the enduring connections we forge. The fight wasn't over. It had just taken on a new, much more personal form. The poppy seed cake for Mrs. Gable was just the beginning. I delivered it to her myself the next morning. The look of surprised delight on her face, the tears that welled up again, this time for a different reason, were more rewarding than any profit margin. She insisted on paying, pressing crumpled bills into my hand, but more importantly, she asked if I might consider baking her son's favorite lemon drizzle cake for his upcoming birthday. Word spread, as it always does in a close-knit community, not through aggressive marketing, but through whispered conversations over garden fences and at the local post office. Did you hear? Eleanor Ainsworth is baking again, from her home. Soon, a few more old friends and former customers reached out, tentatively at first. Eleanor, I know you're tired, but no one makes a shortbread like you did. Or, my granddaughter's christening is next month, and I was just heartbroken about the sweet spot. I don't suppose? Each request was a balm to my bruised spirit. I started small, working from my own kitchen, meticulously sourcing the quality ingredients Mark had deemed too expensive. I insisted on the best butter, the freshest eggs from a local farm, the same Belgian chocolate we'd always used. My days found a new rhythm, one that felt deeply familiar, yet exhilaratingly new. The early mornings were once again filled with the scent of baking, but this time, it was on my terms, driven by my standards. The joy of creation, pure and unadulterated by corporate jargon or bottom-line pressures, returned. However, I soon realized that passion, while essential, wasn't enough. My little home kitchen, while cozy, had its limits. And while I knew my craft, the idea of managing orders, even a small number, felt daunting after being so unceremoniously sidelined. I needed a sounding board, perhaps even a bit of practical help. I thought of Sarah, my late husband Arthur's niece, a bright young woman in her late 30s who worked as a freelance graphic designer. She had always loved the sweet spot and had been quietly appalled by Mark's changes. I invited her for tea. As I laid out my best china and a plate of freshly baked madeleines, Arthur's favorite, I confessed my tentative foray back into baking and my burgeoning idea to do something more formal, albeit small. Sarah, I said, my voice a little unsteady. Mark thinks I'm too slow, that my ways are obsolete. But people seem to miss, well, they miss what the sweet spot used to be. Sarah listened patiently, her expression thoughtful. When I finished, a slow smile spread across her face. Aunt Ellie, she said, her eyes sparkling, your slow ways are what made that place magical. Mark's an idiot if he can't see that. And frankly, this town is desperate for your baking again. What you're doing isn't obsolete. It's authentic. It's exactly what people are craving in this fast food world. Her validation was like a burst of sunshine. She wasn't just being kind. She genuinely believed in what I was doing. Over the next few weeks, Sarah became my unofficial partner and cheerleader. She helped me set up a simple online presence. Nothing flashy, just a tasteful webpage with photos of my baking, taken by her, with an artist's eye, a clear list of what I offered, and an easy way to order. She designed elegant, understated labels and packaging. We'll call it Eleanor's Hearth, she suggested one afternoon, as we were brainstorming. It sounds warm, inviting, traditional. Everything the sweet spot under Mark isn't. I loved it. It felt right. Sarah also introduced me to Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant who had been a loyal customer of the sweet spot for years, the very same whose wife had lamented the dry scones. Mr. Henderson, a man of quiet integrity and sharp intellect, offered to look over my rudimentary finances and help me navigate the necessary paperwork for a small home-based food business. Eleanor, he said, his eyes twinkling after sampling one of my signature apple pies. This isn't just baking, it's a public service. And I'd be honored to help you ensure it's all above board, with Sarah's creative energy and Mr. Henderson's calm, methodical guidance. My little venture began to take shape. I meticulously documented my recipes, not the adapted versions Mark might have wanted, but the originals perfected over decades. I found suppliers who cherished quality as much as I did. It was hard work, make no mistake. There were days I was on my feet for 12 hours, my back aching, my kitchen looking like a flour-dusted war zone. But it was a satisfying ache, a joyful chaos. I was building something again, something that was mine, built on principles I wouldn't compromise. And with every perfectly risen loaf, every batch of flawless cookies, every grateful smile from a customer, the sting of Mark's dismissal, the insult of too slow, began to fade, replaced by a quiet, growing confidence. I was slow, yes, slow enough to care, slow enough to do it right. And it turned out that was exactly what people wanted. Eleanor's Hearth didn't explode onto the scene with a flashy launch or aggressive advertising. Its growth was organic, gentle, like a well-tended sourdough starter. Word of mouth was our most potent marketing tool. One satisfied customer would tell two friends, and those two would tell two more. Sarah suggested a stall at the weekly farmers market, a place I'd always loved for its vibrant atmosphere and commitment to local producers. The thought of being so public was a little daunting at first, but Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious. Our first market day was a revelation. I baked a modest selection, my classic scones, a few fruit pies, some loaves of artisanal bread, and a batch of the lemon drizzle cake that had become a quiet legend. We set up a simple table with a checkered cloth, a handwritten sign, and Sarah's beautifully designed leaflets. The response was overwhelming. Familiar faces from the Sweet Spot days lit up when they saw me. Eleanor, is that really you? Oh, I've missed your baking. The warmth in their greetings, the genuine delight, was more invigorating than any espresso. We sold out within 3 hours. I returned home that day, tired but elated, with an empty cash box and a full heart. Mark's Zoom Sweets, as I'd heard it was now officially called, also had a stall at the market, a much larger, flashier setup with bright banners and staff in corporate-looking aprons. I noticed, with a pang that was part sadness, part vindication, that their stall was far less busy than ours. Customers would glance at their mass-produced-looking items, then their eyes would drift to our more rustic, clearly handcrafted offerings. The contrast was stark. My slowness was, as Sarah had predicted, my greatest asset. Each item from Eleanor's Hearth told a story of time-honored techniques, of patient proving, of careful baking. The bread had a deep, complex flavor that could only come from a long, slow fermentation. The pastries had a flakiness that couldn't be rushed. Customers didn't just buy a cake or a loaf of bread. They bought a piece of tradition, a taste of authenticity. They bought the care I poured into every item. We continued with the farmers market, and our little online ordering system, managed by Sarah, saw a steady increase in traffic. I focused on a curated menu of classics, the things I did best, rather than trying to offer everything under the sun. Quality over quantity, always. Mr. Henderson helped me keep meticulous records, ensuring every penny was accounted for, every regulation met. He'd often stop by on market days, ostensibly to check the takings, but mostly, I think, for a slice of whatever pie was freshest. He'd observe the quiet hum of activity around my stall, the satisfied customers, and then he'd look over at Mark's increasingly forlorn-looking setup. Slow and steady wins the race, Eleanor. He'd murmur with a smile, echoing my own private mantra. Whispers about Mark's venture were becoming more frequent and less complimentary. The coffee's bitter, one former regular told me. And the bread tastes like cardboard, lamented another. I heard stories of staff dissatisfaction, of high turnover. Mark, in his pursuit of speed and volume, had forgotten the human element, both in his product and in his team. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. There was no joy in seeing the legacy Arthur and I built being tarnished, even if it was under a new, dreadful name. But there was a grim satisfaction in knowing that my core beliefs about quality and care were being validated, not just by my own modest success, but by Mark's very public struggles. I never spoke ill of his business. When customers made comparisons, I would simply smile and say, "I just bake the way I always have, the way Arthur taught me," but inside, a small, resolute part of me thought, he called me too slow. Now he's learning that fast isn't always best, especially when you sacrifice the soul of the thing you're creating. Eleanor's Hearth wasn't about competition, not in the aggressive, cutthroat way Mark seemed to view business. It was about preservation of recipes, of standards, of a way of doing things that valued craftsmanship over convenience. And slowly, carefully, with every perfectly baked item, I was not only building a new venture but also reclaiming my own story, one delicious, authentic bite at a time. Mark, for a long time, seemed entirely oblivious to my quiet resurgence. If he heard snippets about Eleanor's Hearth, he likely dismissed it with the same condescending air he'd adopted when he first marginalized me. "Mom's little baking hobby," I could almost hear him saying to Susan. Keeping her busy, I suppose he was too consumed with his own grand plans, his aggressive expansion strategy for Zoom Suites, which, from what I gathered, involved scouting locations for 2 more branches in neighboring towns. He was all about scaling, about franchise potential, about becoming the next big thing in quick-service baked goods. His vision was so fixated on the horizon that he failed to see the crumbling foundations beneath his feet. The initial gloss of Zoom Suites was beginning to wear thin. The novelty of bright lights and speedy service couldn't mask the declining quality and impersonal atmosphere for long. Online reviews, which Mark had initially touted as a key metric of his modern approach, started to turn sour. Used to love the sweet spot, but Zoom Suites is a pale imitation. Dry muffins, weak coffee, and staff who look like they'd rather be anywhere else avoid. Overpriced and underwhelming, I never sought out these reviews, but occasionally Sarah would read one aloud, not with malice, but with a kind of sorrowful headshake. The decline was palpable. Fewer people lined up at his farmer's market stall. I'd see unsold trays of identical, characterless pastries being packed away at the end of the day. Susan, when I encountered her at the supermarket, looked increasingly strained. Her usual chirpy pronouncements about Mark's brilliance were replaced with tight-lipped comments about the challenging economic climate or fickle customers. Money, I suspected, was becoming an issue. Mark had invested heavily in the rebranding, the new equipment designed for speed rather than finesse, and the marketing campaigns that promised much but delivered little in terms of lasting customer loyalty. Meanwhile, Eleanor's Hearth continued its gentle, steady growth. We weren't aiming for world domination, just for excellence in our small corner of it. A local food blogger, charmed by our story and the quality of our offerings, wrote a glowing piece about us, complete with beautiful photos Sarah had provided. It caused a little flurry of new interest, orders coming in from people who hadn't known me from the sweet spot days but were drawn to the idea of authentic, handcrafted baking. I hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Chloe, who had worked briefly at Zoom Suites and left due to the toxic, high-pressure environment. Chloe was eager to learn, respectful of my methods, and possessed a gentle touch with pastry that reminded me of myself at her age. She told me stories of Mark's increasing frustration, his tendency to blame his staff for failings that were clearly systemic, rooted in his decision to prioritize speed and cost-cutting above all else. "He just doesn't get it, Mrs. Ainsworth," Chloe said one afternoon, carefully shaping croissants. "He thinks if he just pushes harder, cuts more corners, people will come. But they want what you make. They want something real." I rarely saw Mark directly during this period. Our paths seldom crossed. But I felt his presence, or rather, the growing shadow of his failing venture, like a silent commentary on my own quiet progress. There was no triumph in it, not yet. Just a profound sense of melancholy that he had strayed so far from the principles Arthur and I had tried to instill. He was so determined to prove I was slow and outdated that he failed to see he was the one rushing headlong towards a precipice, blind to the warning signs I had tried, however gently, to offer him. My focus remained on my work, on the steady rhythm of baking, on the smiles of my customers, on the quiet satisfaction of building something true and lasting, one carefully crafted scone, one perfectly baked loaf, at a time. His blindness was his own burden to bear. Mine was to continue to prove that slow was simply another word for quality, for care, for love. The turning point, the moment Mark could no longer ignore the quiet hum of Eleanor's hearth and the deafening silence of his own venture's decline, arrived with the annual town harvest festival. It was a significant event, drawing crowds from all over the county. For years, the sweet spot had been a beloved fixture, our stall always a popular destination. This year, both Zoom Sweets and Eleanor's Hearth had applied for and received vendor spots, positioned, by some ironic twist of fate, almost directly opposite each other on the main green. I had been apprehensive about such a direct, public comparison, but Sarah and Mr. Henderson had encouraged me. "This is your chance, Eleanor," Mr. Henderson had said, "to let the quality speak for itself on a larger stage." We kept our setup simple and elegant, a larger version of our farmer's market stall, overflowing with an abundant array of my best-loved creations, pies bursting with seasonal fruits, rustic breads, delicate pastries, and a three-tiered celebration cake, showcasing intricate piping work as a centerpiece. Chloe and Sarah were there to help, both radiating a quiet confidence that bolstered my own. Across the way, Mark's Zoom Sweet stall was a riot of garish orange and purple banners. He had twice the space, a team of uniformed staff who looked harried before the festival even officially opened, and stacks of pre-packaged goods under heat lamps. He himself was striding about, barking orders into a headset, the epitome of a stressed, modern entrepreneur. As the gates opened and the crowds began to pour in, the difference became starkly, almost painfully, apparent. A steady stream of people, many of whom I recognized as old sweet spot regulars, made a beeline for Eleanor's Hearth. They greeted me with warmth, their eyes feasting on the handcrafted goods. "Oh, Eleanor, it's just like it used to be. This is what we've been missing." The compliments flowed, genuine and heartfelt. We were busy from the moment we opened, a cheerful, bustling energy around our stall. Across the way, the scene at Zoom Sweets was different. People would glance at it, some drawn by the bright colors, but few lingered. I saw Mark's expression grow tighter, his movements more agitated, as the morning wore on. His staff tried to entice passers-by with free samples of lackluster cookies, but the enthusiasm just wasn't there. By midday, we had sold out of several popular items, while Mark's displays still looked largely untouched. It was then that he finally acknowledged my presence. He strode across the green, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, Susan trailing nervously behind him. He stopped abruptly in front of my stall, ignoring the customers who were waiting. "What do you think you're doing, Mom?" he hissed, his voice low and venomous. I calmly placed a lid on a box of scones I was handing to a customer before turning to him. "I'm baking, Mark," I replied, my voice even. "It's what I do." "You're deliberately trying to undermine me," he accused, his voice rising. "You set up right opposite me, selling all the old stuff you know my customers miss. You're stealing my business." A few nearby festival-goers paused, their attention caught by the unfolding drama. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, but I held his gaze. "Mark," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside, "I am not stealing anything. These are my recipes, my methods. I am offering people quality, something you decided was no longer important. If customers choose to come here, perhaps it's because they appreciate that." Susan tugged at his arm. "Mark, please not here," she whispered, her face pale. He shook her off. "You're too slow, remember? Too old-fashioned. This little hobby of yours, it's a joke." His words, meant to wound, no longer had the same power. I saw past the anger to the fear and desperation in his eyes. He was flailing. "Perhaps," I said quietly, "some people prefer a slow joke that tastes good and is made with integrity." His face contorted, and for a moment, I thought he might truly lose control. But then, a respected town councilor, who is also one of my regular customers, stepped forward. Everything all right here, Eleanor? She asked, her gaze coolly fixed on Mark. Mark was just admiring our setup, weren't you, dear? I said, offering a small, polite smile. The counselor's presence seemed to deflate him. He glared at me one last time, a look of pure resentment, then turned on his heel and stalked back to his deserted stall, Susan scurrying after him. The rest of the day, our stall was swamped. We sold every last crumb. As we packed up, tired but triumphant, I glanced over at Zoom Sweets. They were packing away mountains of unsold goods. Mark was nowhere to be seen, but Susan was directing the staff, her face etched with exhaustion and a dawning, unwelcome understanding. That day, he hadn't just seen me as Mom. He'd seen me as a competitor, one whose slow and old-fashioned ways were inexplicably, infuriatingly winning. The mask of his confident disdain had slipped, revealing the bewildered and failing businessman beneath. The town festival marked a clear shift. The quiet success of Eleanor's hearth was no longer a secret, and the struggles of Zoom Sweets were becoming public knowledge. The fallout from the Harvest Festival was immediate and undeniable. Mark's outburst had been witnessed by too many influential community members, and the stark contrast between our bustling stall and his empty one became the talk of the town. His carefully constructed image of a dynamic, forward-thinking entrepreneur was rapidly crumbling, replaced by the reality of a business in visible decline, run by a man who seemed increasingly out of touch and desperate. He did try, in a clumsy, panicked way, to emulate what he perceived as my success. Suddenly, artisanal and home-style specials began appearing at Zoom Sweets, hastily made, poorly executed versions of the classics he'd so disdainfully abandoned. But the customers weren't fooled. Authenticity can't be faked, and years of goodwill, carelessly squandered, couldn't be reclaimed with a marketing gimmick. His attempts felt hollow, a desperate mimicry rather than a genuine return to quality. I heard through Chloe, who still had friends working at Zoom Sweets, that the atmosphere there was dire. Mark was irritable and accusatory, blaming everyone but himself for the failing business. Suppliers, wary of his mounting debts and erratic behavior, were starting to demand cash on delivery. Staff morale was at an all-time low. Two of his key employees, a talented young baker he'd initially praised and a capable front-of-house manager, resigned within weeks of each other, citing the impossible pressure and lack of respect. The financial strain on Mark and Susan became increasingly apparent. Their talk of opening new branches ceased. Susan, whom I encountered at a local charity event, looked harried and confessed, in a moment of unguarded honesty, that they were facing some headwinds. It was a massive understatement. One blustery November afternoon, about a month after the festival, Mark appeared at my doorstep. He looked gaunt, shadows under his eyes, his expensive suit rumpled. He didn't have the bluster of the festival. He looked defeated. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can I come in?" I led him into my cozy living room, the scent of gingerbread from my afternoon baking lingering in the air. He sat stiffly on the edge of Arthur's old armchair, a place he used to curl up in as a boy. I need to talk to you," he stammered, avoiding my gaze. "Zoom Sweets, it's not doing well. In fact, it's sinking." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. "I made some mistakes. I misjudged the market. I underestimated." He couldn't bring himself to say, "I need help, Mom," he blurted out. "Alone. Or maybe you could buy me out. Your little Eleanor's hearth. It's doing surprisingly well. You could take over the Zoom Sweets locations. Rebrand them. You've got the goodwill." The irony was almost too much to bear. The son who had dismissed me as too slow, too old-fashioned, was now begging me to rescue his failing empire, built on the ashes of my legacy. He was, in essence, asking me to bail him out of the consequences of his own arrogance and greed. I listened patiently, my heart a strange mix of pity and a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just about money. It was about everything he had taken from me, everything he had disrespected. My little hobby, as he had once called it, was now his only lifeline. Before I could respond, Mr. Henderson, whom I had called earlier for an unrelated matter and who was due to arrive, rang the doorbell. I excused myself and let him in. Mark looked startled to see him. Mr. Henderson, ever the professional, greeted Mark politely, but with a certain reserve. I explained briefly why Mark was there. Mr. Henderson listened, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Mark, your financial situation with Zoom Suites is, from what I understand through public records and industry talk, quite precarious. Significant debt, liens from suppliers, possibly even back rent on your flagship location, the original Sweet Spot building." Mark flinched. "It's not that bad," he mumbled, but his lack of conviction was telling. Mr. Henderson continued, "Eleanor, on the other hand, has built Eleanor's Hearth with prudence and integrity. No debt, a loyal customer base, and a reputation for quality that is, frankly, stellar." He then turned to me. "Eleanor, I know the bank that holds the mortgage on the original Sweet Spot building. Mark has, I believe, defaulted on several payments. The building, the one Arthur loved so much, it's likely to go into foreclosure soon. If it hasn't already started proceedings." A silence fell, thick and heavy. Mark stared at the floor, his face ashen. The full weight of his failure, the true extent of his miscalculations, seemed to crash down on him in that moment. He had not only destroyed his own venture, but had also jeopardized the very bricks and mortar that held decades of our family's history. My mind raced. The original Sweet Spot. The place Arthur and I poured our hearts into. To see it lost, shuttered, or worse, turned into something completely alien. The thought was unbearable. And then, a path became clear, a path that offered not just vindication, but a chance for restoration. It wasn't about bailing Mark out, not directly. It was about reclaiming something precious. I looked at Mr. Henderson, a silent question in my eyes. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. "Mark," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I will not give you a loan to prop up Zoom Suites. And I have no interest in acquiring your failing brand or its other poorly chosen locations." His face fell. "However," I continued, "the original Sweet Spot building, that is another matter. Mr. Henderson, would it be possible to make an offer to the bank, to acquire that building, should it become available?" Mr. Henderson's smile was discreet. "I believe, Eleanor, that the bank would be very receptive to a sound offer from a reputable buyer, especially one with a proven track record of running a beloved community bakery from that very location in the past." Mark looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, a flicker of something, anger, humiliation, crossing his face. He had come asking for a lifeline, and instead, he was witnessing me plan the reclamation of the very foundation he had let crumble. The poetic justice was not lost on me, nor, I suspect, on him. The signing of papers wouldn't happen that day, but the intent was clear. I wasn't just going to beat him in his own business. I was going to reclaim the heart of it, the very place where it all began, the place he had so carelessly undervalued. His fast and modern approach had led to ruin. My slow and old-fashioned ways were about to bring the Sweet Spot home. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of quiet, focused activity. Mr. Henderson, with his characteristic efficiency and discretion, handled the negotiations with the bank. As he had predicted, Mark's financial situation was dire, and Zoom Suites Incorporated was insolvent. The original Sweet Spot building, the one that held so many of Arthur's and my dreams, was indeed heading for foreclosure. Our offer, backed by the solid financial health of Eleanor's Hearth and my impeccable history with the location, was viewed favorably. There were legal procedures, due diligence, and endless forms to sign, but through it all, I felt a calm sense of purpose. This wasn't just a business transaction, it was a reclamation. While the lawyers and accountants did their work, I continued to run Eleanor's Hearth from my home and the farmer's market, my loyal customers largely unaware of the seismic shift that was about to occur. Sarah was my rock, her enthusiasm and practical support unwavering. Chloe, my assistant, worked tirelessly, her quiet dedication a constant reassurance. Mark, in the meantime, was forced to face the brutal consequences of his hubris. Zoom Suites officially declared bankruptcy. The other lease locations he had ambitiously acquired were shuttered, their garish signs taken down. He had to lay off his remaining staff. I heard whispers of angry creditors, of bailiffs at his and Susan's smart suburban house. Susan, when I saw her briefly at the pharmacy, looked like a ghost of her former self, her usual brittle confidence shattered. She mumbled a barely audible greeting and hurried away. The day the sale of the original Sweet Spot building was finalized, I walked down to the familiar storefront with Mr. Henderson. The Zoom Suites sign was still there, a vulgar scar on the face of a beloved old friend. But the windows were dark, the door locked. A notice of closure was taped to the glass. Mr. Henderson handed me a set of keys. "It's yours, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle. "Welcome home." My hand trembled as I unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, tinged with the faint, lingering scent of artificial flavorings and desperation. The chrome and glass fixtures Mark had installed looked cheap and out of place. It felt violated. But beneath the surface, I could still feel the building's true soul, Arthur's gentle presence, the echo of decades of happy customers, and the comforting aroma of honest baking. The next few weeks were dedicated to exorcising the ghost of Zoom Suites and resurrecting the Sweet Spot. We ripped out Mark's cold, modern fittings. Weary painted in warm, welcoming colors. I found some of the original wooden display cases stored in the basement, dusty but intact. Sarah designed a beautiful new sign, the Sweet Spot. EST 1985, Eleanor Ainsworth, proprietor. It was simple, elegant, and true. Old customers, seeing the activity, would stop by, their faces alight with hope. "Eleanor, are you really coming back?" The outpouring of support was overwhelming. I even rehired two of the bakers Mark had let go in his cost-cutting frenzy, talented individuals who understood quality and were overjoyed to return. The day we reopened the Sweet Spot, under its original name and my stewardship, was a day I will never forget. There was no grand ceremony, just the quiet unlocking of the door at 7 a.m., but by 7:05, there was a line stretching down the block. The aroma of real butter, fresh coffee, and slowly fermented bread filled the air once more. The sound of happy chatter, the clinking of cups, the genuine smiles, it was all back. I stood behind the counter, my heart full, serving Mrs. Gable her plain poppy seed cake, just as I always had. Mark was not there. I heard he and Susan had downsized significantly, moving to a smaller rental in a less fashionable part of town. He was reportedly trying to find a job, any job, his dreams of entrepreneurial glory in tatters. There was a profound sense of justice, yes, but also a lingering sadness for the son who had lost his way so spectacularly. My victory wasn't just about business. It was about the restoration of dignity, the reaffirmation of values, the reclaiming of a legacy. The Sweet Spot was alive again, its heart beating strong, a testament to the enduring power of doing things slowly and well. The relief was immense, washing over me in waves, carrying away the last vestiges of hurt and betrayal. I was home. The revived Sweet Spot thrived beyond my wildest expectations. It was as if the community had been holding its breath, waiting for the return of something genuine, and now they exhaled in a collective sigh of relief and delight. Our days were filled with the familiar rhythms of a busy bakery, but this time, it was infused with a deeper sense of gratitude and purpose. Old customers returned in droves, bringing their children and grandchildren, sharing stories of what the Sweet Spot had meant to them over the years. New customers, drawn by the buzz and the irresistible aroma, quickly became regulars. Chloe blossomed under my mentorship, her skills as a baker growing daily, her quiet enthusiasm a joy to witness. Sarah continued to handle our marketing with her usual flair, creating a warm online presence that reflected the bakery's heart. Mr. Henderson remained my trusted advisor, offering sage counsel and celebrating our successes with a slice of his favorite apple pie. We weren't just selling baked goods. We were selling comfort, nostalgia, and a connection to something real in an increasingly artificial world. We reinstated all the old favorites, using the exact recipes Arthur and I had perfected. We brought back the community notice board, We remembered people's names and their usual orders. It was, in every sense, a return to the core values Mark had dismissed as too slow and old-fashioned sometimes. Customers would ask about Mark. I would simply say that he was pursuing other interests. There was no need to air dirty laundry. The town already knew most of the story. His downfall was a quiet, private sorrow for me, a reminder of the fragility of family bonds when greed and arrogance take root. I did hear, indirectly, that he had found a job as a regional sales manager for a food distribution company, a far cry from the entrepreneurial heights he had envisioned for himself. Susan, I was told, had gone back to work as a part-time administrative assistant. They were making ends meet, but the grand lifestyle they had briefly enjoyed was a thing of the past. One rainy afternoon, several months after the sweet spot had reopened, Mark appeared in the bakery. He looked older, tired, and considerably humbled. He stood awkwardly by the door, clutching a worn briefcase, looking at the bustling warmth of the place he had nearly destroyed. I was busy serving, but I nodded to him, indicating he could wait. When there was a lull, I approached him. "Mark," I said quietly. "Mom," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to say, this place, it looks good. It looks like it should." He paused, struggling for words. "I was wrong. About everything. About you, about the business. I was arrogant and stupid. I thought I knew better." He finally met my eyes, and I saw a genuine flicker of remorse there.
"I'm sorry, Mom."
For the things I said, for what I did. I destroyed so much. It wasn't a grand apology, but it felt sincere. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify his actions. "Thank you for saying that, Mark," I replied. There was a long silence. Then he asked, his voice hesitant, Is there anything I can do?"
"To help?"
"I mean, not here, obviously, but—" I considered his offer. The old wounds were still there, but the raw anger had faded, replaced by a weary sadness. "Perhaps," I said, "you can start by rebuilding your own life, Mark. Learn from this. And perhaps, one day, you can learn to value the things that truly matter." He nodded slowly. "I am trying, Mom." It's slow. The irony of his choice of words was not lost on either of us. He bought a small black coffee, no fancy name, just coffee, paid for it, and left without another word. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and certainly not a full reconciliation. But it was a beginning, a tiny crack of light in a door that had been slammed shut. My own new beginning was already well underway. The sweet spot was more than just a business again. It was my sanctuary, my legacy, and a vibrant hub for the community. I found peace in the daily rhythm of kneading dough, the scent of baking, the smiles of my customers. I had faced betrayal and disrespect, been underestimated and dismissed. But I had found the strength to not only survive, but to reclaim my passion and my dignity. I had proven that slow could be strong, that tradition could be timeless, and that the heart of a business, like the heart of a family, needs to be nurtured with care and integrity. The sweetness had returned, not just to the pastries, but to my life. And that was the most profound vindication of all.